Hi, this is Jeff. This is the second in a series of videos where I'll be showing you some experiments I did with Unity Game Engine. In the first video, I showed a game of life simulation I did with Unity. Now, in this video, I'll be showing a simple RTS game that works in VR. So what are RTS games? RTS stands for real-time strategy, and this is a genre of game where all players move together in real time, as opposed to turn-based games where players move one at a time. You can generally play versus an AI or other human players, and these sorts of games require fast reflexes as well as good strategy. Just to give a brief history of a few key games in this genre, first is Dune 2, which came out in 1992. This was the first usage of the term RTS. Next was Starcraft, came out in 1998 by Blizzard, which was a great game. And then 12 years later, Starcraft 2 came out. Frankly, this was one of my favorite games of all time, perhaps one of the best games of all time. And in fact, this game is still played by a lot of players. One person estimated that there was around 1.2 million ladder games a day as of February 2021. Now, although the RTS genre has waned a bit in the last few years, there are still some big titles that come out now and then. One good example is Age of Empires 4, which was just released in October of 2021, this year. I wanted to briefly talk about two past projects that are related to this current project. The first of them is ArtSG, which stands for A RTS Game. It's a full-featured RTS game that I made for the Windows platform around 2001, and of course it was inspired by Starcraft.
Ready to fly.
The second game is Play the Field, which is a game that I did for the iOS platform supporting both iPhone and iPad. It's also an RTS game, but it's much more simplified, and the units are represented by geometric shapes like dots and circles, etc. You can create and move units with single taps, and although I put the game on the store in 2015, it's still available as of today for free, so please check it out if you're interested. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. So now, finally, onto the game, which I'm giving a tentative title of VR FPRTS. Arguably not a really good title, and I'll probably change that eventually, but for now. The reason for that is it's not just an RTS game, it's actually a hybrid FPS RTS game, which uses virtual reality. And of course it was inspired by ArtSG, which is inspired by Starcraft. The main goal was to see what an RTS game would look like in VR. Now, I did hear that there is a few RTS games already there for various VR platforms, but I haven't played them myself or investigated them much. What I'm doing in this prototype is just to have some of the ideas in my head and see how they pan out. I decided to de-emphasize graphics because making good assets takes a lot of time, but instead I wanted to emphasize the gameplay and the feel of the game. The features are pretty straightforward, and there's only one gameplay mode at present, which is to protect the main tower. There's a big tower in the center of the gameplay field, and you need to stop the enemies from destroying it. When they destroy it, you lose the game. The unit control is also pretty simple, with just the ability to select, move, and tell the units to attack something, for example another unit. And there's a money system whereby money will gradually accumulate over time. You don't have to do anything in this prototype. And you can use the money to purchase units and towers, real time in the middle of the game. And these units and towers will attack enemies. And you can also use your controller and the trigger button to shoot directly at enemies, which is a bit like a FPS game. So it's not really a pure RTS game where you're not able to do that. So for the initial prototype, I ended up spending only 4 or 5 days, and there was only a few hours a day, so it wasn't a huge effort.
Alright, I just put on my VR headset. You can see as soon as we enter the world, there's a large tower in front of me. This is what I have to protect as the main objective of the game. We have the funds, which is essentially the money, the tower's hit points, and the level. The level determines the rate at which the enemies spawn. So if I look around, pretty soon I know an enemy is going to be spawning in. I heard it. Where is it? There it is. So I'm going to create some units here. They're going to auto-attack when they get within range. I'll direct this guy to attack because he's a little too far. Create 2 more. Help out over here. Another one here. Direct this guy to help out over here. Let's see. Anybody over here? Okay, we got one coming in. Alright, now I'm going to direct these guys closer to the tower. Okay. You guys come back here. Now there's some more coming in. This guy should also go closer to the tower. Shoot this guy myself with the right controller. I have just enough money for a tower, which I'm going to build right in front of me. As soon as it comes online, you can see it's going to start shooting. I should out this guy over here. And the one on the other side. Now it's shooting this guy here. For myself. Already taking some damage. Who's hitting us? This guy here. These guys are not helping out. Should have them moved. Alright, a lot of guys here. Let's build another tower. Oh, not enough money yet. So these guys can come over here to help out if they can. Okay, tower's helping out. Pretty strong. Alright, so there's another guy over here. Shoot him. I'm taking damage. Uh-oh. Alright, we're almost dead. Let's make one more tower. So this can help me out. These guys go over here and help. Almost dead. We lost. But it was a good game.
So for the tools used, I ended up using Unity version 2020.3.23F1, which was, I believe, the currently recommended version. I only used the built-in packages except for a handful of packages. There's the Oculus integration packages, which is one of the main ways to use VR development on Unity. There was also a texture pack that was free that I got off the asset store for the ground texture that you saw. And there was also a few sound files, like the gunshot sound that you heard earlier. And finally, I used Oculus Quest 2 as my only VR headset. So, what did I learn? There was a lot of things I learned in this project, but above all, I learned that when you're using VR, it's such an immersive technology, and things that would normally matter when using typical desktop or mobile games matter even more. Some things like the frame rate, flickering you might experience, things being too dark or too bright, even bad colors. These things really have a bigger impact because you're really right inside of another world. The screen is literally in your face and you have the sound there right in your ears. And everything is just really getting to you more. It's really having a bigger impact on you and you feel it more. So those visual things, also the ease of use, how you use the controllers, the buttons. For example, I noticed that it's harder to select units when you're using VR as opposed to with a mouse and a simple 2D screen like with a desktop or a mobile. So that's something that has to factor into the design of the game. Also, I ended up using two cursors as you saw in the demo, but I found that awkward in the end because sometimes I got mixed up the left and the right, which cursor is which, and it's just a counterintuitive thing, especially given the fact that most of the time we only use one cursor, a mouse cursor or a trackpad, whatever. Using two cursors is definitely something that will take time to get used to, so I think it's probably a bad idea. If you noticed, I had the text in the background, which showed the level, the money, and the health of the tower. And I ended up using a technique called world space, where it's kind of pasted there on the part of the world at a certain location. The disadvantage of that is if I change my location, it's going to change where it is. So in other words, I might turn, then I have to look to the side to see what the level is. Or I might have to turn around behind me, turn my neck, and it's generally awkward. The other option is to use screen space where you kind of paste it on the screen so it always is in the same spot. That's actually better in terms of always having the information at your fingertips, but it just looked odd. So it would take some more experimentation to find the best option for the UI. And finally, even sound is, I felt it was more sensitive in VR games. I had a case where one of the bullet sounds had a roughly 200 millisecond delay, and it really felt awkward. So I ended up removing that delay, and it really improved the feel of that. In terms of Unity, overall I found that it was pretty easy to use, at least much easier than I thought it would be to use. While there were a few things that I had trouble with, one of the things was the initial VR development setup. In a previous project, I spent several days on this, installing projects and again, just basically making a new project, adding the components, and trying to build. And I found it was very difficult to actually get it where I could build a live build and a full build, and it was just really tricky. And part of that was because there was actually a bug or two in Unity, and I had the wrong version of this or that. There's a lot of issues that I ran into, but I was able to get through that in a previous project, and now I have the experience that I can just quickly go through that process. I also decided to use a test project for the initial camera controller setup, which was the distance grab project that has a lot of cool stuff in it anyway. I ended up deleting most of the things. For example, there's a bunch of objects and such, but I just used the camera controller setup. I found that saved me a little bit of time. A few other things, for example, I discovered layers and tags are a really good way to make finding objects easier when you're doing development, and you could also filter some operations in order to improve performance. Making compound or complex objects is definitely tedious. That kind of stuff is really intended to be done outside of the tool in, for example, a third-party tool like Blender or something else, and then import it. So if I do that in a future game, or if I make this game better, I'll probably want to do that, because as you can see, the elements I made are pretty simple. There is some situations where you have to do 3D operations, and you have to use things like vectors and quaternions, and those can be a little scary. But the good news is that there's many examples that I found online, and even the documentation for Unity is pretty good. It's written well and it has a lot of examples. Another minor thing, I was playing some sounds with audio source, and I expected it to just do what I thought it would do, which is play a bunch of sounds in succession. And it did do that, but if I basically played a sound before the previous sound stopped, it would cut off. And that's because you can only play one sound at a time using audio source. So to make a more natural sound, when I shot several bullets in sequence, I ended up using multiple audio source components. And finally, I noticed there were some trade-offs with the physics engine. And whenever I decided to use the physics engine with an object, I noticed there's an extra level of realism. It made things fun to play with, and it was just very dynamic. It's fun. But on the other hand, there was some unexpected behaviors, and I ended up doing a lot of tweaking and testing, going back and forth. For example, I had a case where I was trying to shoot the bullet from the player and have that track an enemy. But using it as part of the physics engine and making it move at the same time, it's possible, but it was just a lot of work. I was trying to add a force and it was kind of working, and I was fighting against the physics engine. So in cases like that, I just disabled the physics engine by removing the rigid body component, or I just didn't add that component to begin with, and it made things a lot easier. Now there's other cases, like when you see when a unit dies, there's a bunch of balls that appear kind of representing the unit being destroyed, and I left the gravity on for those, left the physics engine on. It just looks like a nice effect, and that doesn't really affect the gameplay that much. It's just a nice visual effect. So in the end, I decided to only use the physics engine when I absolutely need it. A few other notes: I ended up with only around 800 lines of C# code, which is pretty small given what you can do in the game. That's because Unity itself has a lot of features built in. There's also, of course, the packages like the Oculus integration, which do a lot of things for you, so it saves a lot of your time. I did use Git. Even though this is a prototype, I found that doing prototyping with Git and keeping my changes stored there really helps. Not only for just backing things up, but also being able to see a log, and I can make branches so I can go back to other points in time. And even just seeing my changes and having the satisfaction of getting a change in, it feels much better than just randomly making changes to a code base without any feeling of having accomplished anything. So I highly recommend using Git even if you're doing just prototypes. Another thing that I spend a lot of time with is trying to reduce the cycle time. And that's because every time you make a change and you want to test it, the quicker the cycle time is, the quicker you're going to get things done. So if I just test in the game without using the actual VR hardware, by using the window of my desktop machine on Unity, it only takes about a second or two. And I can actually test some things that way. If I put things right in front of the camera, I can't actually control, but I can watch them evolve. So there are certain things that I could test, like for example, a bullet being fired, an enemy moving. I can test those by just staring at the window on my desktop machine. Now, if I want to actually use the VR, what I can do is use Oculus Link, plug it in, and then kind of run the build from Unity on my desktop. But then instead, I would be using it through the VR. So it's basically like a hybrid approach. So that's pretty good, and it only takes 4 or 5 seconds to just put on the actual Oculus Quest 2 and grab my controllers, and 5 to 10 seconds max, I could get it so I can start testing. Now, of course, that doesn't really show the exact experience, especially in terms of performance, because the calculations are generally being done on the PC itself, the desktop, not on the actual VR hardware. So to get a real test, I have to actually build an APK file and put that to the device. There's a few different ways to do it, but the quickest approach still takes a minute or two. So that's something I only do once I get things working really well using the Oculus Link. A few other things I used for troubleshooting, like debug statements, sort of software 101 stuff, but I found that really helpful. I was able to troubleshoot a lot of issues with relative ease by just using debug statements. I didn't have to try any live stepping through or anything like that. Another thing is that when I kind of made the objects, I wasn't thinking that much about object-oriented design, but then in the end, I ended up making some similar objects and some duplicated behavior, duplicated code, and when I get back to the code base, when I make more changes, I'm going to need to refactor it first because it'll make much more efficient code, so I don't want to have things duplicated all over the place. So that's one thing, even for a prototype, that's something to keep in mind. Finally, because of how long Unity takes and how much memory it takes, you really need a fast machine with a lot of memory to improve your cycle time and to just make development much faster. I had a machine with only 8 GB memory from a few years ago. It was a gaming laptop, but it was just too slow, and it took sometimes 10 minutes to do certain builds. So I ended up getting a Predator Helios 300, which is pretty expensive, but it was totally worth the money because now things are much faster. Now finally, about game development. Game development is a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of work. If you notice, I have a bunch of things on the screen here, like asset creation, animation, AI sounds, controls. A lot of these things I did address in my prototype, but some of them I only touched on briefly, or some of them, like multiplayer, they take a huge amount of work. So it's the kind of thing, if you're getting into game development, you'll see that there's a lot of things you might not normally think about that are going to take extra time. So you have to kind of be prepared for doing these sort of things if you ever make your own games. And finally, as I mentioned, there's some refactoring I'd like to get to. And I mentioned I added this FPS element where you can actually shoot from your player, which is a bit odd because most RTS games don't have that. So I might remove that, or maybe I'll try to integrate it in or change it a little bit. Of course, there's going to be a lot more experimentation, implementing testing. This is really just the beginning of the project. As I said, I just spent a few days, and there'd be a lot more time required to get this to something I could actually ship. Now, I could release this sort publicly eventually, or maybe even put it on the Unity Asset Store as like a kit, or I could just release it on App Labs eventually. That would be really cool because then I could get a pretty big audience for the game. All right, well, you can find me on LinkedIn if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.